Let us start. Just say welcome all, and this is a series that is associated. This is really Chris's faculty series that connects with the general CHR Crisis and Uncertainty series, which has been unfolding for the last year. We have today we have Steve Kern with a very interesting discussion of the pace of the internet, and look forward to that. We have one more session for this year in the regular series. Joe Manning will be here in 2 weeks to talk about ancient Egypt and India and China too, in relation to volcanoes and climate change. So it'll have a diverse audience. And then next year, we're starting to have our schedule is starting to firm up, and we'll have more to say about that as I can nail down some more dates, but we're getting close. So on that note, let me hand off to Chris.
Thank you. And this is the second in a sort of occasional series that we've got of faculty members, not just in history, but across other disciplines, presenting sort of work or work in progress related to our theme of crisis. And today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Kern, who is Humanities Distinguished Professor in the Department of History, specializing in modern European cultural intellectual history. And Professor Kern has published an awful lot of books. I just want to draw attention to his most famous book, Anatomy and Destiny. Sorry, not Anatomy and Destiny, Steve, The Culture of Time and Space. 1880 to 1918, which was originally published in 1983, transmitted into many languages. This is the book that probably most of you will be familiar with if you've read Steve's work. And Steve's going to give a talk today called Pace in the Internet Age, which is part of a project that is, in a sense, updating the culture of time and space for the last 30 years or so. Steve can talk about this in more detail. I'm going to hand over to him now. Thanks so much, Steve. Off you go.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for all of you for attending. I have a few informal comments on how this article came to be, and then I'm going to read a text, which is a pruned down version of a chapter on pace. To make a big wind up, I have to go back to my dissertation, which I finished in 1970. It was on Freud. It was a history of ideas. I didn't psychoanalyze Freud. It was what it was new in his thinking about childhood. And in the process of writing it, I became something of what I would call a de facto Freudian. I didn't intend to be a Freudian, but I was just sort of immersed in that theory, and it seemed to make a lot of sense. And a couple of years after I finished it, I ran across some criticisms of psychoanalysis by existentialists, or more precisely phenomenologists, who were critical of the medical model of Freud. And that is the undertaking to diagnose, treat, and cure, which is what we expect shrinks to do. We expect doctors to do it. That's fine. But the conceptual framework of psychoanalysis did not seem to me to be a suitable framework for a general cultural history, which was what I was going to undertake to do. And so I did proceed to write this book titled The Culture of Time and Space, came out in '83. And in the introduction, I claim that since my focal topics, there were 9 total subtopics of time and space, since they're all universals with different historical modes, that it should be possible to interpret how other periods, other cultures experience those same 9 modes. And 30 years later, no one had done that. So I was myself impressed by the impact of the internet and smartphones on the experience of time and space. And I thought, well, I'll undertake to do that. So that's what this book really was all about. I rely to a great extent on technologies as a causal factor. And that approach is much criticized as technological determinism. And I have to admit to being a card-carrying technological determinist. However, there are other things that determine the course of history, to be sure. In my field, cultural history, works develops in literature, science, philosophy, and art. But technology has a unique causal force in that it's temporally specific, has a number of virtues. The technologies tend to be transnational. They are invented at a specific moment in time, more or less. Of course, there's modifications. But I mean, for example, telephone was invented in 1876. No one before then could make a telephone call over many miles. After it is possible. And you can't reinvent the telephone. At least you can't reinvent it for the first time. History is one way. I don't buy this argument that the history repeats itself. It doesn't repeat itself. And I don't think any historian would believe that sort of thing. That whole notion is self-contradictory. History can't repeat itself. So I'm not going to get into that, but I really find technology very compelling. And so that was the sort of causal agent in this new book. And I was going to deal with the later period. I was going to compare the period of my earlier book, that is, how do people experience time and space, circa 1900, and how do they experience time and space circa 2000, or over the last 40 years. And technologies go a long way toward explaining the changes. And that's sort of the basic structure of the book. My reasoning is dialectical. That is, I think things are developed in pairs. Things are not just sort of one-sided. And I want to just give you one example, famous example of non-dialectical reasoning, which is quite well known. It's David Harvey's conception of spatial and temporal compression. And in 1980, David Harvey, a very well-known geographer, argued that new communication technologies and transportation innovations have created a situation of spatial and temporal compression and expansion. Yes, he does say expansion, but he goes on to sort of neglect the expansive aspect of it. And so the concept of, say, shall we say, spatial compression became very well known. In 2020, I checked on the internet, there are 100,000 references to spatial compression. What happened to expansion? He gives an example of this and talks about the global village, McLuhan's concept of the global village, but he misinterprets it because while village suggests the compression of experience, global is the expansive aspect. But, and that's so global village is a kind of oxymoron, but he neglects that and he proceeds to talk about spatial compression, temporal compression. Well, these technologies, the internet, yes, it compressed space in that I can shop in a bookstore in London without going there. So, but also it sort of, in a sense, that compresses space, but it also expands my reach, expands my spatial reach. And so that feature pervades the reasoning, and you'll see this when I get into the written text. Finally, there are 3 interpretive arguments in the book, and let me just briefly outline what they are. The first is epistemological, and I argued that the more people came to know through technology, the more they realized how much more there was to know, and how little they understand what they thought they did. And for one example would be the genome, the human genome, which reveals a great deal about human experience. But after mapping the genome, people, of course, well, while they were doing it, they realized, okay, the genome is made up of 3 billion base pairs that make up the human genome. But what exactly do all those base pairs do? And how do they do it? So this tremendous expansion of knowledge increased a great deal of uncertainty and opened up areas of research. So that's the first argument I call the epistemological argument. The second argument is ethical. And this is an argument that creeps into a lot of discussions of the internet, whether it's good or bad. What is its value? And many discussions, I've read lots of them in the process of preparing this book, very critical of what it does to society, to the family, to the individual, to the mind, to the economy. But I nevertheless came up, my main ethical argument is that more is more. that these technologies create more possibilities for doing things. And they do this in response to tremendous needs, increasing needs of human populations that rely on technologies to produce things faster, communicate faster, transmit things more rapidly. And I will, as I said, I'll get into this in my paper. And then the final argument is what I call a hierarchization argument, that experience is sort of hierarchical. For example, open and closed. This is one hierarchy. Is it good for your character, your personal identity? Is it good to be more open, or is it good to be closed? Well, technologies open things up. They open us up. If you go on Facebook, you're opening yourself up. And of course, you can turn off Facebook and you can retreat. And we have a lot of discussions of privacy being invaded, surveillance economy. But people seem to sort of want these technologies. But nevertheless, these technologies make possible a reordering of traditional hierarchies. And you can just, I would just comment on it, on what's going on in Ukraine, the role of technologies. I mean, Putin, he couldn't invade Ukraine without all these technologies, transportation and communication. And in order to do it, he's enlisting his communication technologies to propagandize his followers in Russia, but he's shutting down technologies. He's trying to control this irresistible modern technology, namely the internet. Okay, well, let me now, I'll just read this paper. It takes about 20 minutes and then open it up for discussion. This talk comes from a chapter on pace in a book that compares changing experience of time and space between two 40-year periods, roughly 1880 to 1920 and 1980 to the present. This talk focuses on the later period that I call the internet age. The fundamental distinction that gives pace its meaning is between fast and slow. Those terms are dialectically interconnected because their meanings arise out of each other. Fast means not slow, and vice versa. Their values also arise out of one another. While some had a negative value because they could harm lives as well as the planet, they also had positive value because they offered more possibilities for satisfying human needs and desires. The value of fast over slow is deeply rooted in the natural world. Over hundreds of millions of years, animals evolved ever stronger legs, fins, and wings to run, swim, and fly faster, enabling them to catch prey or escape predators that likewise became stronger and faster. My argument is that since 1980, new faster paces from technologies emerged dialectically with new modes of slowing. For example, from the earlier period, if a man traveled to work on a horse for 20 years and then started traveling in a car, the effect was a dialectical mix of an acceleration and a slowing, because although the new journey was faster, that acceleration transformed his former traveling into a pace that it had not formerly seen, namely slow. His new pace mixed fast and slow because both paces contributed to what he became. He was able, indeed obliged, to think about possibilities of pacing as more or less fast or slow in ways that were not formerly possible. As one grows older, one does not jettison one's past like a booster stage of a rocket, but carries it along as it continues to shape experience. With respect to the history of pacing, new technologies sped up the pace of current existence, but transformed the pace of years past, the stuff of one's life, into something slower. So the overall effect was a mix of faster and slower. Commentators in the later period denounced how new speedy technologies cost jobs by replacing human labor with robots, invaded privacy through intrusive surveillance, and polluted air and water, leading to species extinctions and environmental degradation. imperiling human survival. Some new technologies indeed magnify these problems, but one must keep in mind two key facts. In 1927, the world's population was 2 billion. Currently, it is 7.8 billion. These rising populations want to stay warm in winter, stay cool in summer, travel fast at will. They want cheap energy and abundant clean water. They want to follow economic changes and communicate as quickly as possible. The hope of becoming independent of fossil or nuclear fuels with solar or wind also depends on technologies, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries. Many problems that alarmists address are more a result of the needs of rising populations than of the technologies invented to satisfy those needs. The ability to choose between faster and slower increased in the later period as more paces became possible, and thereby offered a fuller cultivation of human potentials. However, not everyone had more choices because they did not have enough money to buy new technologies, or enough training to use them, or enough infrastructure to access them. Slow food restaurants were gestures against excessive speed, not serious alternatives for a world in which many were malnourished. Many technologies indeed harbored dangers, but without them, billions would overheat in the summer, freeze in winter, or starve. The ethical argument surfaced while I was writing a chapter on pace, and found myself engaged with criticisms of the faster pace of life made possible by new technologies, in particular the internet. That engagement centered on my growing understanding that new faster paces engendered a new appreciation for slowness in eating, working, walking, as well as in literature and the arts. New technologies offered more choices of fast or slow, appropriate to different situations. And those choices expanded possibilities and thereby enriched experience. My survey of prominent techno-pessimists sets up the celebrations of slowness that follow. The faster that technologies accelerated experience, the more people were inclined to cultivate slowing. And the overall impact was a faster, slower dialectic. That was not faster and then slower, but faster and slower arising out of each other. That dialectic was richer because more ways of pacing became available, and was more humanizing because those ways increasingly fulfilled the human capacity to choose among possibilities. New accelerating technologies enable people to see more combinations of paces, from fast to slow, and appreciate their interactions and meanings. Recent years abound in speedy technologies. Digitized media made it possible to receive more communications on a variety of devices, at a variety of paces, at more times. Speed dialing, texting, and FaceTime enhanced telephonic communication. The dial-up internet piggybacked on existing telephone lines. Fiber optic cables further accelerated the internet's speed and range. The basic communication shift was from immediate point-to-point transmission through fixed telephones and telegraphs to communication through the moving or multiple endpoints of smartphones, laptop computers, and the internet, expanded by search engines and media technologies such as Facebook, Twitter, and Zoom. Farmers boosted food production with chemical fertilizers, intensive feeding, growth hormones. Bankers accelerated economic transactions with auto bill pay, money counting machines, and ATM machines. Credit companies introduced credit cards, instant loans, and PayPal. Online businesses devised Amazon.com, one-click ordering, and TV retail that fostered a frantic mentality of buy it now or you'll never be able to get it again. Factory production accelerated with supply chain management. just-in-time production, containerization, and robotics. The power for accelerated production based on computer processing speeds accelerated at extraordinary rates. The 2015 iPhone 6S processed information 120 million times faster than the mainframe computer that ran the Apollo 11 moon mission in 1969. While the 2017, this is just 2 years later, iPhone X processed information 240 million times faster, meaning that the speed increase in those 2 years equal the increase over the 47 years between 1969 and 2017. Faster got lots faster. Video games accelerated the pace of entertainment. Speed dating accelerated courtship and love. Pacemakers and in vitro fertilization accelerated bodily processes. Prozac and Ritalin accelerated mental processes. Frozen dinners, microwave ovens, fast food restaurants, and speed dieting or liposuction accelerated eating habits. Wikipedia sped up the acquisition of knowledge. And in a category of its own were drive-through funerals with a coffin on display behind a window. For speed enthusiasts, speed was good. I always think of the Wall Street, where what's his name, Michael Douglas says, greed is good. This is my speed is good, Mom. Speed was good. Those who bought computer or mobile phones found speed to be a source of efficiency, productivity, flexibility, and thrills. While some internet users bemoaned how it caused isolation, stress, sleep deprivation, invasion of privacy, and addiction, others celebrated its miraculous information processing powers. An impassioned debate about the harmful physiological effects of excessive travel speed mounted after 1980, although much of it was wrongly conceived, because steady speeds are not harmful, while accelerations can be. In 1961, John Glenn orbited the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour with no ill effects, while fighter pilots passed out at much slower speeds from too much acceleration, measured by the number of Gs to which they are exposed. Nevertheless, critics fulminated over the way speed introduced to maximize profits degrades personal health and the slower deliberative processes of liberal democracy. Crisis mongers, and by the way, I'm not crazy about the word crisis. It's not a sort of phenomenologically precise term, but I don't want to get into that, but it's not useful for me. It sells books, it attracts attention, but it's just not really precise. Crisis mongers made sweeping generalizations about the harmful effects of speed that were unsupported by the historical record, clash with common sense, and sometimes revealed underlying admiration for the very speeds they decried. In 1965, Alvin Toffler coined the term future shock to describe the shattering stress of individuals who underwent too much change in too short a time. But he offered no criterion for measuring too much change or too little time. He proposed the concept in his best-selling book, Future Shock, from 1970, which characterized the current world as, quote, the most challenging environment to which man has ever been exposed, without documenting such a historical claim. Future shock, he added, is the dizzying disorientation brought on by the premature arrival of the future. But he offered no criterion for what makes a change premature. He also made unsubstantial generalizations. For example, that we no longer feel as men did in the past, and offered an alarmist predictions about a future that will bring a massive adaptational breakdown to which we are doomed. The book's huge commercial success, 16 million copies sold to date, shows that it tapped into widespread anxieties about rushing toward the future and feeling unable to keep pace. But amid the warnings are hints of admiration, how this supposedly future-shocked society generates a new elemental force, and how some people seem to thrive on change and crest its waves joyfully. Jeremy Rifkin's book titled Time Wars from 1987 made a similarly apocalyptic analysis of the disruption of so-called natural pace of life. Rifkin overgeneralizes, excuse me. He overgeneralizes about computer-generated deviants, such as computer compulsives, who demand brevity, are impatient with open-ended conversations, and prefer simple yes-no responses, and computer nerds, is termed, who speak too fast, interrupt others, and are out of sync with their surroundings. Robert Hassan's book titled Empires of Speed from 2009 inventories the dire results of the new empire of speed. New speeds cause anxiety and alienation. Hassan misclassifies depression as another speed-generated pathology because it in fact involves a slowing of emotions. I propose rather that underlying every sense of faster, the mind harbors a sense of slower that makes speed intelligible. Manics who rush about are stressed by the prospect of going too slow. Accordingly, technologies that magnify speeds harbor opposite notions of slowing integral to their fundamental meaning. That dialectic is the focus of Lutz Kepnick's analysis of a new slowness in contemporary film, video, sound, installation art, and writing. Slowness, Kepnick writes, sharpens our sense for the coexistence of different and often incompatible vectors of time, and in so doing, invites us to reflect on the impact of contemporary speed. New speeds truncate the present, while slowness opens, quote, the opulence and manifoldness of the present. All paces are poised between faster and slower, and their meaning comes from the tension between them. Kepnick challenges slow life missionaries and celebrates a more balanced slowness that wants not simply to reverse the new dominion of speed, but to transcend any one-sided favoring of fast or slow. Quote, once denigrated as the tool of conservatives or reactionaries, he maintains, slowness is a crucial function to challenge deterministic fantasies of mindless progression and instead develop concept of meaningful progress. Thus, new modes of slowness help bring into focus the new empire of speed. These pairings illustrate how the faster people travel and communicate, the more they're inspired to slow down. And that expanding awareness of the dialectic of faster and slower evinces more varied, complex, and humanizing possibilities. Lifestyle. I discuss four kinds of experiences that accelerated communication, production, transportation, and lifestyle. So these remarks here are just from that last section on lifestyle. Faced with the opening of a McDonald's near the Spanish Steps in Rome in 1986, the Italian journalist Carlo Petrini handed out bowls of pasta while chanting, "We don't want fast food, we want slow food." This protest grew quickly. 3 years later, the international slow food movement, supported by members from 15 countries, was inaugurated in Paris. Its manifesto announced, "We are enslaved by speed and have all succumbed to the same insidious virus. Fast life, which disrupts our habits, pervades the privacy of our homes, and forces us to eat fast foods." By 2017, the organization had over 100,000 members. It aimed to draw more enjoyment and meaning from food and from life. It taught natural gardening, lobbied against genetic engineering and pesticides, supported small-scale food processing, educated people about the risks of fast food, warned about reliance on too few varieties, and created seed banks to preserve heirloom foods. It also promoted slower eating while focusing on how foods are produced and what those processes signify. The movement aligned with other efforts to promote meditation, slower reading, slower traveling, and slower sex. Some critics warned about the value of the slow food movement. Eric Sue argued that cooking from scratch does not reduce the time squeeze in a harried society, but may add to it. The movement may compromise civility by forbidding time-saving technologies, such as freezers and microwave ovens, so that it becomes more difficult to coordinate and share a meal with others. Proscribing reading, talking, or watching TV while eating may necessitate hurrying other aspects of life. And urging people to go, quote, beyond the dichotomy of fast or slow, he proposed rather increasing options of faster and slow. Over the last 40 years, technologies radically accelerated travel, communication, production, and lifestyle, my 4 major subtopics in this chapter, and made possible a new dialectic of fast and slow. Entrepreneurs produced and sold them, and billions eagerly purchased and came to count on. While new, faster speeds conjured up dangers, they also introduced new possibilities to choose among more paces. While speed can kill, as it did in the lead up to World War I and the terrorist attack at 9/11, it also fulfills primordial instincts to go where one wants to go, say what one wants to say, and make what one wants to make, and live the way one wants to live as fast as possible. While some new technologies might destroy life on Earth, others might also save it. And the majority of these technologies are not going away. They were invented to sustain and improve the lives of nearly 8 billion people. For all the pitfalls of the internet, no one wants to go back to slow dial-up connections. While commentators argue for and against new speeds, one position is indisputable, that new technologies make possible new speeds that enable more choices about pacing. Faster and slower are not preferable by themselves. In fact, they are meaningless without one another. And an increase in the ability to choose between them has positive value, a judgment that billions make with every click of their mouse that they expect will produce instantaneous results. Even members of the slow food movement called for the ability to choose between faster and slower. As Petrini explained, quote, if you are always slow, then you are stupid. And that is not at all what we are aiming for. He sought more choices in pacing. Being slow, he wrote, means that you control the rhythms of your own life. You decide how fast you have to go in any given context. We are fighting for the right to determine our tempos. The ability to choose between faster or slower became increasingly possible in a later period as more paces became available. And these new possibilities offered a fuller cultivation of life generally. On the sole basis of increasing the possibilities for choice, more was indeed more. However, not everyone had more choices because they didn't have enough money to buy the new technologies, or enough knowledge to use them, or enough infrastructure to access them. Slow food restaurants were for those who had plenty of money to buy food that had been slowly and carefully prepared and the leisure time to eat it. But many did not have the money or the time. Great dancers must be able to perform not only a leg lift and a forte turn, but perform them at whatever pace they choose. In baseball, fastball pitchers also need a changeup and the ability to throw both pitches with control. New technologies increase choices in the paces of life. New accelerating technologies harbor dangers, but without them, billions would overheat in the summer, freeze in the winter, or starve. While the debate between techno-pessimists and techno-optimists continues to rage, few hold that more choices per se are bad. The most nuanced ethical arguments affirm the positive value of faster and slower and celebrate the increasing opportunities for people to be able to choose whatever pace is appropriate to their needs. Vinny.
Thank you, Steve, for a very interesting talk. I'm going to open this up for questions, and I suggest that we just have, just put your hand up if you have a question, and I will reach out to whoever speaks first.
Well, David Brecky had a glove up.
I think it was a clap.
Oh, that was a clap. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
There's a clap feature as well as a hand up feature. So who wants to go first? Sarah.
Okay, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much, Steve. That was a lot of things I just hadn't thought about. And I guess one of the things while I was thinking in terms of fast versus slow, is how we've sort of internalized some of these ideas, and perhaps some of this, how it comes about in language to reflect our thoughts. And, you know, you said something about slow being stupid. Well, let's face it, fast is reckless. It's morally loose. It's promiscuous. Is our language going to be changing soon to reflect some new ideas, or is that sort of how we also generally think about pace? Because I mean, you did say there's a lot of panic about things that are fast moving. Do we get better with this over time?
Yeah, we do. You know, I can't make any kind of sweeping claim about language. You know, the thrust of the talk was, let's not bellyache so much about the negative effects. Let's face it, we all love these technologies. If we had to use a slow telephone dial-up, we'd be screaming and hollering. This is what we have to live with. And you know, it may destroy the planet. It may destroy life. I understand that. I'm not, you know, I'm very pessimistic about human beings being around a couple hundred years from today. But but it's the 8 billion people. I think if we could go back to 2 billion people, we would be easier on the environment. As far as language, I don't think I answered your question, Sarah, exactly. Do people speak faster?
So part of that actually is just the way we define those words. I mean, the way we define fast, like it's a fast crowd, or she's a really fast person. It's sort of like it's promiscuous, it's reckless. To me, it just sort of suggests that we have very defined views of what that fast pace is, and they're all super, super negative. I guess I'm sort of wondering if we'll be abandoning that at some point, or if that just reflects an older view that hasn't changed yet, or.
I don't know what's coming. I just know that I guess my easy target is Alvin Toffler and Future Shock, which is sort of sticking in my craw for many years. I'm also envious of the 6 million copies that he sold, but that's how you sell books. You have this catchphrase, oh, sure, Future Shock. I mean, you hear it in popular culture all the time. Sure, we're in shock because we're racing in the future. We can't handle it. Well, that's just not true. And I think if you look carefully at exactly what is the actual experience, how do people experience these technologies, you see greater richness, not this one-sided alarmist rejection. We can't handle this. We're rushing to our death. I mean, we may be, John.
Steve, I wonder, thinking as a contemporary historian, I wonder whether you have any thoughts on shifts. In other words, you paint a bold Alvin Toffler position. I'm thinking about Alvin Toffler, which I read in Afghanistan 45 years ago. Somebody was curled up in a ball and we realized he was a deep culture shock. But what about the COVID experience? And what about the life with the internet? In other words, since 1995, we have been on this accelerating curve of experience with that internet speed. And the question is, are these anxieties that you paint, is that too much of a Tofflerian 1969 fear of the future? And I mean, I guess my question is whether or not we have reached something of a plateau in our anxieties about the speed of the internet, the speed of, and we've begun to build a new accommodation. And I would suggest that life in the last 2 years has been a simultaneous slowing down and speeding up. We all have gotten a lot more facile with, here we are, slowing down and speeding up. We gain a huge amount of time, and we have these intensive experiences that are not quite like being in person, but you know, we take the time for them. So anyway, I'm just wondering about the experience of the last 2 years as an inflection point, perhaps the experience of the last maybe 15 years.
Well, I do discuss the last 2 years, and I compare it because remember I'm comparing 2 periods. So these pandemics fit perfectly into my time frame because you have the 1918 influenza epidemic, which killed between 50 and 100 million people, and they didn't have rapid communication, so you were isolated. You couldn't find out what was happening elsewhere instantaneously. Science couldn't quickly come up with a vaccine. There was no vaccine. They didn't even know what was killing them. They called it a virus, but they didn't know what a virus was. They treated it like a bacterium anyway. So all these speedy technologies, including Zoom, I mean, you know, back then they were totally isolated, and the thing ripped through, you know, the virus ripped through a culture very rapidly. But you didn't have technologies basically that it made it possible for us to slow it down. I mean, it may not seem to you, as we've lived through it, that it slowed down, but it sure was slowed down compared to 1918.
Yeah. And
we closed borders, and we coordinated science, and we're able to know where are the doctors, where are the beds, where are the ventilators. It's extraordinarily well coordinated to stop it, to slow it. So, I mean, this is my paper is just an appeal to sort of look carefully at pacings. What are the actual pacings, and step back from the headlines and the talks about crisis and breakdown and shock and see what exactly is going on. So I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get to a sense of I mean, whether something has happened to maybe not, but maybe whether or not we have gotten we've gone through an adjustment period that allows us to live in the fast future more comfortably than people were doing in 1969, or I'm flashing back to the 1880s and the massive sort of cultural fears about germs and electricity and you name it. The speeding up of society in the late 19th century was, you know, at the time profoundly disorienting. And you know, and then by the 1920s, people had essentially accommodated to that wave of expansion. I wonder if we're in a moment of where we're accommodated to an expansive a wave of time-space changes in the time-space continuum.
Well, accommodation is always a challenge. You mentioned, you know, that earlier period. Take the July crisis, which led to the outbreak of the war. One of the points I make, actually, in my earlier book, and I make is that one of the reasons that the war started is a failure of diplomacy. That's a standard textbook explanation. And one of the reasons diplomacy failed is that was happening so rapidly, too many things all at once. And Bettman Holveg is complaining about, I'm getting telegrams left and right. I can't handle all this. And his secretary is complaining about it. And they all are. And they rush into war. So there's a case where the accelerated pace of communication through telephone and wireless telegraphs accelerated the pace in a very dangerous way. And it would have been good to slow down. And that was an example of trouble. And then the telephone was used to fight the war. You could only fight wars, although with railroads bringing masses of troops and telephones coordinating attacks, generals didn't sit on horses on mountains overlooking the battlefield. They were in telephone headquarters, coordinating tens and hundreds of thousands of men along fronts stretching for, sometimes 10, 20 miles. It's only possible by speedy communication. So yes, it can be very disorienting, and that's in fact, I argue this about Trump too. And well, I'm sort of ranging widely here, but I see, Hitler, Trump, and Putin in a sort of a single trajectory of dictators who rely on new communication technologies on populations not used to these technologies to manipulate them and to cause and enable them to have tremendous power. Hitler used the new microphone, loudspeakers, and radio to mesmerize the German population. And I think they were particularly susceptible to that, like people susceptible to a new disease. They don't have resistance to it. They can't handle it. And the same thing with Trump. I mean, I think, how is Trump able to suddenly be manipulating, 50, 60 million people? Because he could tweet in the middle of the night 10 times a day. No one had that kind of power to communicate so rapidly. And I think people weren't quite ready for it. They weren't ready to sort of handle it and process it. They were inundated by it. Plus 24/7 Fox News. And Putin's the same thing. He's been trying to get hold of the technologies and suppress communication. So they all, anyway, there's other similarities too.
Yeah.
Find easy enemies and targets and scapegoats and so forth. But these technologies play a role, and they're disoriented, and people can't handle it. And I just say, as historians, let's get away from the headlines and the panic and the talk about crises and look at exactly what each technology does and does not do.
So more questions on the issue of fast and slow in the internet age, how it relates to Steve's earlier work. It's a wide-ranging talk, so let's have some more questions. And if you put your hands up in the chat, that would be ideal.
David's got his hand up.
David's got his hand up. Okay, I can't see the hand.
I have a real hand up, so you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I have people in my house answering my question when I said, "Can you hear me?"
Okay.
So Steve, this is fascinating and really interesting to listen to, especially as an ancient historian. But it takes me sometimes a while to process what all this means. But one of the things I'd like to ask you about that's kind of like, what is the effect of speeding up, is about, like, let's just think about intellectual discourse as someone you've written about Freud and, Karl Barth even, and all these people. When I teach the Reformation, one of the things that I say to the students is that, one of the reasons it proceeds the way it does, this is banal, right, is the printing press, but the speed with which, Martin Luther, in those days, he had a thought and he could publish it and it would be immediately available, right? And I think in some ways that shapes the way he thought and the way we receive the way intellectual discourse proceeded. Now I just noticed, this updated Outlook or whatever it is we all use wants to finish all my sentences. It I realize that, and they start giving me words and they just say, hit tab, and these words. What do you think is going to happen to just human thinking among elite intellectuals? Do you think we're all going to become like tweeting? Is it going to, how is this speed up, which exists how do you think this is going to affect how we, and not by we, I mean we people who our job is to write things and to think important thoughts. How do you think this is going to affect what we do and how our discourse proceeds?
Well, I like these technologies. I couldn't do what I do. I couldn't have written this book without Wikipedia, for example, which is, it's got problems and so forth. But I can look up stuff in a second. I used to have to go and get my encyclopedia. I can look at an article, not only the article, Wikipedia, now you can just click, as you know, you can just click the references. That tremendously accelerates scholarship and improves it. Just makes it better. If I can have an article on my screen in 10 seconds, as opposed to having to put all, that's to the advantage. And you mentioned, the Reformation, the printing press. one of my inspirations is McLuhan from many years ago for the earlier book. And his first book was on Gutenberg, you know, and on printing and its effect on speed. His
Right.
motto is the medium is the message.
Mhm.
I'm not so sure. I wouldn't go that far, but I really do think these new technologies change how we're experiencing. What is going to happen? I don't know. I just think I think scholarship is probably improving. You know, I can do things I couldn't do without my word processor. I don't mind it finishing my sentence. I don't mind spell check and grammar check. I like that. You ever look at your computer screen and why the hell is that blue line under my sentence? You know, the experience. I can spend 10 minutes trying to figure out what's wrong with that damn thing. And even on Amazon, when I go to buy a book, it recommends, you know, 10 other books. Oh yes, surveillance, capitalism, you know, they're taking over my mind. Well, I like those lists. I sometimes buy those books and I would never know about them. You know, I'm not, you know, wiped out by these technologies. I'm not really troubled by any technologies, except nuclear weapons and, you know, and the despoiling of the planet and the internal combustion engine, fossil fuels. That's a whole other matter, you know, but that's reality. That's true. I haven't answered your question either. You're asking me these future questions. What is going to happen? I'm, you know, I may be smart, but I'm not a wizard. I'm not a clairvoyant.
Yeah, I guess I'm being a little, yeah, forward looking, but you know, I was just what you said about, you know, now you can just click and have the article or whatever. But you know, what I've noticed in the time between when I was a grad student and now, which is when this happened, is the amount of thinking I used to do just walking to the library to get that article. And during the horrible process of standing at that stupid photocopy machine on the 4th floor of Sterling Library at Yale and photocopying things and stuff like that. None of that thinking time happens anymore. I don't know. It's just, I'm going to stop because no, this is all just like me in my experience. So
yeah, well, I get it. I understand.
Yeah, but a lot of that
Maybe you're
Xeroxing time
older.
was a hell of a waste of time. I mean, come on. I mean, I did a huge amount of Xeroxing, and I wish I had that life back. I mean, I'm with Steve on this. I mean, I can learn things much faster now. Whether I have time to do the quality thinking is probably a matter of trying to do too much. I mean, part of the problem is that we're being challenged to do more, and we do more, and we don't take the time. But I do think that we're but you know, we're getting off the meta into the personal in our little experiences. I really do. Every now and then I run into an old photocopy, greasy photocopy buried in my some of them will be dumped soon. But Steve, how have you talked about this in relation to the wider optimist pessimist debate in really in environmental, or you know, in it goes back to help me here, Chris, you know, the wider debate over the shape of the trajectory of humanity, the optimists and the pessimists, and the problem of you know, the sheer reality that all this computer material that we're using is got to sit somewhere, and it's being cooled by you know, a lot of air conditioning, which is taking up a lot of fossil fuels.
Right.
I mean, it's quantifiable. I don't know. Somebody probably can pop off the percent of the fossil fuel consumption that is actually drives the internet now, and it's a significant chunk of it. You know, it's something like 15 to 20%.
Right.
So how have you handled it? Not how do we handle it, but how are you handling it in your book? I get your message that modern technology is on balance a good thing, that we do live longer, better lives, we the privileged perhaps, but even the not so privileged, even the poor of the world are living longer and living better lives, and no question about that. But you know, how have you wrestled with that problem?
Well, I'd be very simplistic. 2 billion to 8 billion people. I mean, those 6 billion people are doing a lot, making a lot of pollution. And as I said, I won't list all the things that they want. And this is just history. Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, I'm not that much of a misogynist that I wish that 6 billion people would be, in a Malthusian way, sort of, be checked off, of course not. But it's just, when you write a history of it, let's get it straight. Let's just, as you say, you're pointing out something, very, very important to keep in mind. But, when you go to buy a computer or when you sign up for your entire file to be saved on the cloud or on what is it, the crash system at OSU? Yeah, I mean, I didn't object to that. Any of you objected to that? The saving your entire internet every week? OSU copies my entire file. I didn't ask for it, but I'm not going to turn it down. I mean, we can't fight it.
No, I'm not asking you to fight it, but I'm asking you to interpret it.
It's bad.
Yeah.
It's bad. What you're saying is bad,
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean,
big houses, my house, air conditioning, my house. I mean, if I want to feel guilty, sure, I have a house that, if everyone in the world lived in a house as big as mine, we have nuclear power stations, like gas stations. So I drive a
Sorry, Steve, just to interrupt. We have a question from Lee Potter. It feels like people are much more susceptible to conspiracy theories nowadays as people use technology for nefarious purposes. Will we become more adept at handling fake information, or will this get worse? And after that, Jeffrey.
I was looking at Jeffrey's hand up.
Now, there's actually a question in the chat
first.
Then we'll
I didn't hear half of your question. So
okay.
Well, it's in the chat. It's in the chat.
It's in the chat, Steve.
It
feels like people are much more susceptible to conspiracy theories nowadays as people use technology for nefarious purposes.
They're
will become more adept at handling fake information, or will this get worse?
By what criterion more susceptible? Where's the metric here? I mean, weren't people subject to conspiracy theories, 100 years ago? I can't conjure them up, but I'm sure they were. They were probably not as well educated. I don't know. But we get like QAnon. Yeah, that's another big problem. It's spreading on the internet. That's what you're referencing, Chris? Is that it?
I'm not referencing it. It's the question from Lee Potter. But I do think that what she's referring to. I mean, I do you want to speak up, Lee? Yeah.
I don't know how. Oh, there's a chat. I'm not good at looking at the chat linear.
Hey, you got to speed up your life.
I can't
access
it. There it is. Lee Potter. Feels like people are much more susceptible to conspiracy theories nowadays. As people use technology for various purposes. Will we become more adept at handling fake information, or will this get worse? Well, I mean, what do you mean more susceptible to conspiracy theories? I mean, during the First World War, the English were convinced that the Han was coming to get them, that they were going to rape the women, and they went out by the millions, and they went and they died for God, king, and country to protect their women. I mean, that's a diabolical conspiracy theory. 10 million people died. So when I read more susceptible, sure, you can write a book on that and talk about the crisis of conspiracy theories, but I don't know about that. Conspiracy theories go way, way back. I mean, circa 1900, everyone was a racist, everyone was anti-Semite, everyone was a sexist, and they weren't even conspiracies. They were certainly part of lock, stock, and part of what people thought. So, this conspiracy. I haven't read it.
Yeah, I haven't read it either. It's been on my shelf for years. But it is literally a history of American conspiracy theories.
Yeah, well, there were witches. We used to burn
going back, probably going back to Salem.
In the McCarthy era, there was conspiracy theories. I happen to have personal experience of that. Friends of the family committed suicide, divorces, ruined over the Russians are coming, communists. We got in the war in Vietnam over conspiracy theory. So no, I don't buy the premise of that. We become more.
The premise, I'll just interject here, which is to say the premise is valid. In other words, we're probably the same proportion of people who are given to conspiratorial thinking. They now can communicate much, much faster and effectively.
Yes, yes, they can. Yes, they can. Jeffrey.
Hey, Jeffrey, want to come in?
Yeah,
It's actually Lee Potter's question that got me mobilized there, because of course, the talk of Martin Luther, an anti-Semite if ever there was one, but witchcraft is the big conspiracy theory. Witchcraft and plague spreaders. Everybody believes that the bubonic plague is being spread by professionals who go around. So I'm not sure our conspiracy quotient is any less. Stephen, you and I met through your book. I was teaching at Illinois, and I was, I forget, doing something on distance in the 16th century. And one of my graduate students, this would be about 1992, one of my graduate students came in and said, have you read this book by a man called Stephen Kern on the culture of time and space? And I said, no. He said, oh, well, I think you should. So, of course, being obedient, I went to the library. In those days, I still could. And I got it out, and I saw the dates were 1888 to 1914. So I went back the next week and said, well, Mr. Tomlinson, yes, he's terribly prominent lawyer in Washington now, and you're going to see why. Yes, I said, I read the book and I saw those dates. Oh, he said, did you perhaps read the last chapter on the July crisis? I thought, fuck you. So I went and I got it out of the library again, and of course it was brilliant, and it helped to inspire my book on the grand strategy of Philip II, which revolves around the culture of time and space. But here comes my question. I think one of the things I didn't hear you say in your paper, which I realize is just a shortened version, is that although we complain about the avalanche of information, it's more predictable than it was in the 16th century. They too were drowning before photocopiers, before faxes, before the telegraph. They're drowning in information, but it is totally unpredictable. Every letter I read starts off by saying, I have received, and there's a long list of letters, because they can't be sure the other person has got it. They can't be sure how long it took. And I think that maybe is one area where there's a major difference. Okay, emails go astray. USPS is a disgrace, but we have more reliability. We can even have read receipts. We can have real-time discussions like this in which we know the other person has at least seen us, even if they're not listening. And I think that's a major difference, should we say, in the last century, and maybe it's accelerated since the invention of the telegraph, the predictability aspect.
Predictability of what? Of what you're getting?
The predictability of whether your message has got there or not.
Oh.
And how long it takes to get there.
Oh God, yes, yeah.
Those are major concerns in the century where I live.
Yeah. And imagine messages as well as people. If you said goodbye to your son or daughter, got on a ship to go somewhere, go to Australia or, go to the United States, you might never hear. It would be intolerable for us to do without all these things. You have a child go away and you can't talk to them. You don't hear from them for 6 months or a year, let alone get a message back, let alone know that they got it. Sure. So you're a technology lover then, Jeffrey, am I kind of, to put it simply. I mean, you're not an alarmist. You're not a techno pessimist.
Sorry, I hate to raise this issue, but if you're in a wheelchair, the internet is the best thing that's happened for a very long time. I can do my research sitting here in my desk in a way that I've never been able to do it. The more documents are digitized, the more books are digitized, the better. For me, the first COVID period was a golden time because all the books they've digitized were available on emergency consultation. You can't get them now. You have to go to a library. For about 8 magic months, have I set somebody's dog off? I'm sorry. Dogs, I have that effect on dogs. So I find this new technology a lifesaver for my research. I would not be able to research and write books and articles without it.
Well, that's of course, and great to hear. And yes.
So my dog's barking. I apologize. Please, somebody put their hand up. Well, if there are no hands up, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I want you to. I want to sort of. What I want to do is take a couple of comments you said and just push you to expand on them a bit, because one of the things that's quite clear is that access to speed is socially differentiated. Not everybody gets to access speed in quite the same way. Speed, as you said, is something we buy. If you think about premium networks, easy passes on freeways, there are so many ways in which speed is technologically calibrated according to those who can pay, which differentially privileges the white Western male and so forth. And so I wonder how the history of speed fits in with the history of power more generally, and social power. I mean, I think that there's a very famous picture, and I think it's from either Mumbai or from Lagos, where there's actually a gigantic water main that's actually above ground, and in the foreground is a gigantic shadow city of sort of self-built housing, which lacks internet connections, lacks every connection, is completely disconnected. And there's actually a woman walking on top of the water main, which is surrounded by effectively raw sewage, carrying water on her head that she's collected from some kind of standpipe a distance away. Her experience of water delivery is very slow, and is pointedly juxtaposed in this image to the speed at which luxury downtown condos in whichever city in the developing South it is, they switch on their water and out it comes and it's clean and so forth. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about where speed happens, about who it happens to, and how it connects to a broader history of power.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the people with money can buy these speedy technologies, just pure and simple. You mentioned power. As you're speaking, I thought of the phrase knowledge is power. And of course, that equates, I mean, since these communication technologies increase information, I don't know about knowledge. I mean, you want to get into, knowledge is wisdom, that's a whole other matter, but you can really acquire more knowledge, which is a kind of power. And you can see what businesses do when they with big data. Big data is knowledge, and that's power, and that translates into money. This is what's happening. What's your question? I latched on to part of it.
My question was if you could just unpack this business of differential access. I mean, almost on a global basis. I mean, in a sense that there is a sense here that we can talk about speed as if it's at these sort of technologies of pace and so forth, as if they're everywhere, but they are socially unevenly distributed, geographically unevenly distributed.
Well, I can't answer that very well, because my thrust was to generalize about these technologies and not differentiate between which classes have more access to it or which nations. One of the virtues of using technology to explain history is that it's fairly ubiquitous. I mean, it's more the same in all countries of the world than kinship, courtship traditions or religions or personal political philosophies. It has a kind of universal applicability, and that was my research goal, was to identify that general impact. To get into how it's different in different locales just takes me right out of what I'm doing, and it kind of undermines what I'm doing, because I'm generalizing about the impact of these technologies on time and space. And the only difference I make is that the first part of the book focuses on Europe, because the major cultural developments are in Europe, and the second part of the book, for the latter period, deals with America, because a lot of these technologies are invented here, and a lot of cultural developments shift to the United States, particularly with the television and the movie industry in Hollywood, and a lot of the technologies that are invented and used here and sold here. But I can't answer your question. It's a long-winded way of saying I can't really answer how it differentiates spatially or
Okay.
or along class lines either. I mean, the rich can buy the stuff, the poor can't. And but I think
Well,
it
I mean,
has a level of
this
effect. It does have a dehierarchizing. I think it does dehierarchize a little bit. And if I can't flesh it out on the spot here, but I think poor have access to, the poor people couldn't send letters. They had to hire letter writers. Now, lots of people can communicate quickly. So I don't know. That's not giving you a good answer, but
Yeah, I'm not sure what the percentage of people on Earth have internet access, but I would wager that there's several billions who don't.
yes.
So it's
yeah.
Anyway, John wanted to come in here.
Well,
And then
I
we've
just,
got
I mean, it gets us back to, among other things, the simplest thing is I want to get someplace fast. I get an airplane. An airplane has enormous global altering impacts, and I have to think about my carbon footprint. I mean, and there's an enormous literature on the the rise of the new economy and the new speed, and the speed is the essence of that new economy, no question about it. And there are a lot of benefits, but it does. I mean, there really is very difficult not to see the spiraling of fossil fuel consumption being driven by speed. The faster things go, the more fossil fuels are being consumed, the more energy it takes. And it's an energy intensive process to move fast, move things fast, move ideas fast. So this is the paradox. I mean, I'm not trying to, it's a fundamental paradox that is also a moral issue. And it's difficult not to see that in this context. So we can spin around on this quite a bit.
right. But Adrian Comet, do you want to come in here about Amazon workers?
Hello. Yeah, I was just, no, I mean, I don't have a question about that. I have another question actually. But for Amazon workers, no, I was just thinking that speed is also something that Amazon workers suffer because of the speed to satisfy consumption is directly suffered by workers who have incredibly scheduled and no time break, unpaid meal break and this kind of thing. So there is also a cost of speed in that regard, not only in the global south but also in the global north, in Amazon companies. I did, so now that I'm talking, I did have a different question though that I wanted to ask, is about climate change, and I was wondering the extent to which climate change is a new idea, to what extent the fact that science says that the end of the world is happening, to what extent is that new, and to what extent does that change perception of time?
Well, climate awareness of climate changes dramatically in the last 40 years. I mean, I don't recall the exact figure, but the ability to predict the future increases, I think, like 1 day in terms of predicting a hurricane every decade or something, because of these computer models. I mean, we can get 10-day forecasts. In 1920, there was no forecasts. They looked at almanacs, which were just superstition. And you knew when it was raining, when your head was wet. I mean, they didn't have this sort of thing. We have this sort of knowledge, and anyone has it. You don't have to be rich to know what's going to happen, to know a hurricane is coming in 3 days. So as far as climate, yeah, there's an acute awareness of climate made possible, long term. I mean, I have a section on climate, which is knowledge of the future. I have a chapter on the future, and one section is on climate. Climate science has improved enormously. They have literally every second, these computers are getting billions of bits of evidence. They're getting it from down in the ocean, from these things down in the ocean and up about 5 miles and all over the globe and all sorts of sources. And it's all being fed into these models. And you see it on television. You see these little lines to predict different predictive systems. That's all. Anyone has access to that. And that's changed certainly in the last 20, 30 years. And so I do have a whole discussion of that. This is a really good example of the sort of knowledge of the future. The more we know, the more we realize how much more there is to know, and how little we understand what we thought we knew. So that applies. That also applies to diseases like Tay-Sachs and Huntington's. And we know a lot about the predictive ability. There are certain tests now that we have for these diseases, but we still don't know when someone is, particularly Huntington's. You don't know when someone's going to get Huntington's. So we have predictive knowledge, which rich and poor are access to that in clinics and so forth. It's a good thing. I mean, some people didn't want to know. There's a whole protocol about that. Huntington's a very horrible and tricky sort of a thing. Some people just don't want to know. But am I answering your question? I get the feeling I get off of answering all these questions. It's a good question. But clearly, technology are creating all kinds of environmental problems. And they're also making it possible to manage them better than they were 50 or 100 years ago. So that's the larger.
But I'd like to just interject and get back to the question that as I read your question, Adrian, which is that, and it may be easier, and this may be a generational problem, that time suddenly seems shorter for the younger generation. Mm-hmm. Because suddenly we did not grow up. I was just talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis this morning when I was 9 years old. That was a short term. That was a sense of the potential foreshortening of the future. That nuclear holocaust looming over the world, which dissipated around 1975, let's say. But now in the last 20 years, the sense that the future is not some opening thing, but it could be foreshortened in not necessarily a nuclear exchange, but now there was actually just an article in the New York Times about a movement of climate of people. Younger people attacking climate pessimists, saying, "Come on, we got to get going here. Stop wallowing in pessimism." So, Adrian, don't wallow in pessimism. But on the other hand, I think there's something to that question, which is that the sense of live time may be different for different generations in the sense of
an emergency. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. That's the foundation of what I do. Live time changes. Public time doesn't. By the way, there's no such thing as time travel. You can travel in space, you can't travel in time. That's a whole other thing I get into, why my hierarchization argument works more for the space chapters than the time chapters. You can't move in time. You can move through space. So that changes the whole dynamic there.
So we have a question from Laura. Laura, do you want to read the question out, or shall I read it for you?
Oh, really? I just kind of wondered the whole youth culture where young people have a lot of technology coming at them at once. They're on their phones, they've got the TV on, they're watching something on their computer, all at the same time. It's a lot of input, and they seem to, at least the ones that I know, seem to really like that kind of thing, all that information coming at them at once. And I'm wondering if that might result at some point of them. Do you think that there'll be this push to slow down and maybe have less technology coming at them at one time? Because I see my friends who are older really reject that and really don't want a lot coming at them at one time. It's a very different mindset. And do you think that it'll come to a point where people realize that maybe this is too much for them to take in?
I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty overwhelmed myself. My knowledge of the internet, which I'm writing a book about, is less than it should be. Actually, I had a graduate student a few years back who was also a computer science major, and he helped me a lot with my chapter on the present and simultaneity, about all the things that are going on at once. My chapter on present, I say that the present gets longer, wider, and thicker. And I'm not going to elaborate that now, but that whole experience of the present, which is a sense of lived time, and technologies play a big role. I mean, computers I mean, that computer is really, there's all kinds of wheels and quadrants going and at the same time, and many things happening at once. So yeah, I mean, is that good or bad? Is that going to get worse? I don't know. It's hard to keep up. It's very hard to keep up. That's for sure.
Mhm.
Sarah?
So it's following on Laura's point, which again, my observation with my kids, for example, is they can't handle boredom because they're never bored. They never, there's always so many things going on. So it makes me wonder, in the history that you've done, do you see a growing intolerance for slow pace over time?
Probably, yeah. I mean, no one wants a slow computer. No one wants a dial-up computer. We want it now. It's intolerable, and we don't realize we're so used to these things. You can buy tickets online, and you can when you go on a trip, you can pick out your hotel room, and you can consult with people who've been in that very room. Tell you, oh, get room 15 because it overlooks the pool. Don't get room. I mean, changes travel. Puts people out of business. It's transformative, but who wants to not have it? You can not look. You can just, I don't know, how many of you book trips and don't go online and pick out what hotel you want and what part of town, and you can see the map. I mean, how can we do without this now? I don't know. It's not too much all at once. I mean, you look at a screen. I mean, sure, there's a lot of things on the screen. Of course, young people know how to pick that stuff out. When Laura does a little tutorial for me, she tells me to click the box. It takes me 15 seconds to find the box. She knows exactly where it is, and younger people do. We got to keep up. Jeffrey, shall I read your question here? Your comment? May I just go ahead and read? Perhaps the transportation innovation with the greatest impact was the bicycle, because it was relatively cheap. It increased dramatically the radius of travel for both country and town dwellers. It was available to women as well as men. Yeah, it was a bicycle revolution in the 1890s, at least in my earlier period. Yeah, and it went down to classes. I mean, the working people could go on a vacation. I had relatives, this just popped into my head, who lived in the Ukraine, I think in Ukraine. I don't know, the Carpathians, I should know. I know. They lived in Poland. And they used to go on a vacation. He told me they would pack a suitcase and walk. They would walk and they'd spend a week in some inn or something. I mean, we can't, that's just not a vacation for us. We have to go 2,000 miles and, in order to feel we're that's just about distance, not about time. But, the bicycle was transformative, Jeffrey, absolutely. Especially when he got the wheels balanced out and they got rubber wheels. So that took that little improvement.
Do we have time for another couple of questions if anybody wants to add anything?
I got to throw out one.
Okay, you do that. Yeah, sure.
I just throw out one thing. I probably shouldn't say this, but in writing the conclusion to this book, and I can't go into this, I reflected on all my books over the last many years, 7 of them, and they all attempt to ground what I call the accidents of history in these essential foundations of existence. Everyone has a past, everyone has a present, everyone has a future. The way they experience the past, present, future changes and so forth, technology causes these changes. That's the form of my argument in all these books. And what I realized in a shock, in a moment of self-reflection, is that I have no idea how these accidents of history are in fact grounded in these essential elements of experience, which I've been doing for 50 years. And I just leave it at that. It's just, I can't answer it. And I've consulted with phenomenologists, and I've asked Heidegger experts and Sartre experts, and then Heidegger and Sartre don't explain either. Simone de Beauvoir doesn't explain. They can't bridge that gap. And I realized there are gaps, huge gaps in historical works in all scholarship, gaps in the human mind. And I had seen it. And now I see it, and I don't know what to do about it. I thought of writing a book on gaps, my next book, and I thought, no. I'm not going to write a book in which I explain, about all I don't know. But it's just been a sobering experience trying to write a conclusion to this book. I'll leave it at that.
Well, on that fine note, let's have a round of applause for Steve. I want to thank you very much for presenting today, and thank you everyone for turning up in what I hope's been a very illuminating conversation about some fairly major themes of recent history. So thank you all very much. Thanks so much, Steve. Let's all go off and have a fine Friday evening. Take good care, everyone. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.